Elara Vance, a humble florist in a simple handmade dress, stood on the precipice of a dream. She was about to marry the love of her life, Julian Thornton, the handsome and gentle son of a fearsome real estate magnate. The air, thick with the scent of 1,000 white roses she could never afford, felt heavy and unreal. But when Julian's cruel mother, Isabella Thornton, rose from her seat like a storm cloud and declared with chilling certainty, "My son won't marry you," she did more than just shatter a wedding. She ignited a dormant legacy, a forgotten truth buried under decades of lies. In that moment of ultimate public humiliation, a chain of events was set in motion that would unravel a history of deceit. The cruel, mocking laughter of the wealthy guests would soon freeze in their throats. A shocking truth was about to emerge, and the world they knew would be remade by the very person they sought to destroy. Her world was a small one, confined to the four walls of a tiny apartment that always smelled faintly of wilting carnations and strong, cheap coffee. The rent was perpetually late, a constant nagging worry that lived in the pit of her stomach. Her hands, though nimble enough to arrange delicate bouquets, were calloused and stained with chlorophyll, the testament to a life of hard, honest work. They were not the soft, manicured hands of the women in Julian's world, a world she was about to enter, a world she was not sure she was truly welcome in. Her motivation was a pure and desperate thing, sharp as a thorn. It was the image of her grandmother, whose gentle face was growing paler by the day, lost in the sterile white sheets of a hospital bed. The medical bills were a mountain of paper on her small kitchen table, an insurmountable peak she was trying to climb with sheer will. She loved Julian, she truly did. She loved his kind eyes and the way he held her hand as if she were made of precious glass. But a small, guilty part of her knew that marrying him was also a lifeline, a way to pull her grandmother from the churning waters of a failing healthcare system. "You have a good heart, Elara," her grandmother had whispered just yesterday, her voice thin as parchment. Her tired eyes had drifted to a framed photograph on the bedside table. It showed a smiling, sun-weathered man with kind eyes, so much like Elara's own. Your grandfather, Elias, he had a heart like that. He always said the richest soil is found in a kind soul. Elara had smiled, a sad, gentle curve of her lips. She barely remembered her grandfather, who had passed away when she was just a child. She knew him only through stories, as a simple, hard-working gardener who loved the earth and had been lost to the world too soon, leaving behind little more than a legacy of quiet dignity and a few worn-out gardening tools. Then her grandmother had pressed something into her hand. It was an old sealed envelope, the paper yellowed and soft with age. "He wanted you to have this," she had breathed, her energy fading. "He told me to give it to you if you ever face true hardship, the kind that tests the very root of who you are." Elara had looked at the plain envelope, her name written on it in her grandfather's faded, elegant script. It felt weightless, almost empty. Thinking it was just a final sentimental letter, she had tucked it carefully into the small beaded purse she had borrowed for the wedding. It was a fragile link to a past she hardly knew, a ghost's whisper in the face of the overwhelming opulent present. And what an opulent present it was! The wedding was being held at the legendary Beaumont Gardens, an exclusive estate so beautiful it seemed to have been painted into existence. Towering cypress trees stood like silent green sentinels, manicured lawns rolled out like emerald carpets, and intricate flower beds exploded in a riot of impossible color. It was an ocean of luxury, and Ilara, in her simple dress that she had lovingly sewn herself, felt like a single misplaced drop of rain. She saw the looks from the guests as she walked down the aisle on the arm of Julian's father, a man who offered his elbow with the reluctant air of someone handling something unclean. She saw the whispers behind expensive fans, the dismissive glances that raked over her simple attire, the faint, cruel smiles that judged her and found her wanting. She was a weed in a perfect rose garden, an intruder in paradise. She held her head high, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, focusing only on Julian, who waited for her at the altar, his face a beacon of nervous love in a sea of cold disdain. Isabella Thornton did not walk. She swept. She moved through the perfectly arranged crowd of her peers like a galleon in full sail, a magnificent and terrifying vessel of wealth and power. She wore a gown of severe, expensive crimson that seemed to suck the very light from the air, her face a mask of aristocratic boredom that barely concealed a simmering contempt. Her entourage of sycophantic friends trailed in her wake, their laughter as sharp and artificial as cut glass. She did not acknowledge Ilara's existence. As she took her seat in the front row, she leaned over to her closest confidant, a woman dripping in diamonds, and spoke in a stage whisper that carried with perfect clarity through the hushed garden. "Can you believe it? That dress looks like it was made from old curtains. Alistair must be spinning in his grave." The friend tittered, a horrible bird-like sound. "Oh, Isabella, you're awful." But the boy is besotted. "Besotted is another word for foolish," Isabella had snapped, her eyes like chips of ice. "It's an unfortunate phase. It will pass." Ilara felt the words like tiny sharp stones hurled at her back. She flinched, but kept her eyes fixed on Julian. He had heard it too. A faint blush of shame colored his cheeks, but he said nothing. He never said anything. He was a good man, a kind man, but in the gravitational pull of his mother's immense, cruel personality, he became a silent, powerless moon. The ceremony began. The sun was warm, the air was sweet, but a chill had descended over the altar. The officiant, a man whose placid smile seemed painfully out of place, began the familiar rites. He spoke of love, of union, of two souls becoming one. Ilara tried to lose herself in the words, to believe them, to feel the magic that was supposed to fill a moment like this. But her heart was a cold, heavy lump in her chest. Then came the dreaded words, the ancient invitation for discord. "If anyone here has cause to object to this union, let them speak now or forever hold their peace." A theatrical silence hung in the air. For a heartbeat, Ilara thought she had made it. She thought the moment had passed. "I object." The voice was not loud, but it cut through the silence like a guillotine. Every head turned. Isabella Thornton was on her feet, her crimson dress a slash of violence against the serene green of the garden. She moved not with the hesitation of a reluctant objector, but with the cold, deliberate purpose of an executioner. She walked directly to the altar, her heels clicking a death knell on the stone path. She stopped right in front of Ilara, ignoring her son completely. Her eyes, magnified by an arrogant fury, raked over Ilara from head to toe. The disdain was no longer veiled. It was a naked, brutal weapon. "I object to this transaction," Isabella began, her voice dripping with venomous condescension. "This is not a marriage. It is an act of social piracy." A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Julian finally found his voice, a weak, strangled thing. "Mother, please, don't do this." Isabella waved a dismissive hand at him as if shooing away a fly. "Be quiet, Julian. It is time someone spoke the truth. This girl," she said, gesturing to Alara as if she were a piece of garbage, "is a stain on our family, a stain on our name. She comes from nothing, she has nothing. Her only asset is a pretty face she is using to dig her way into a fortune she has not earned and could never comprehend." Tears pricked at Alara's eyes, hot and shameful. She wanted to be invisible. She wanted the manicured lawn to open up and swallow her whole. "Look at her," Isabella continued, her voice rising, playing to the crowd of wealthy onlookers who were now watching with a horrified, rapt attention. "Standing here in her pathetic little dress, pretending she belongs, pretending she has any concept of our world, of beauty, of legacy." Her cruel gaze swept over the magnificent estate. "She probably thinks these gardens are just a collection of pretty flowers." Isabella's lips twisted into a sadistic smile. An idea, a new, more exquisite form of humiliation, had just occurred to her. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger towards the centerpiece of the entire estate, a breathtakingly beautiful ancient fountain carved from white marble where water danced over the sculpted forms of graceful naiads. It was a masterpiece of art and engineering. That fountain, that entire garden, was designed by a master, an artist of legendary status, Isabella announced, her voice ringing with theatrical authority. "His name is a secret whispered only among true connoisseurs, a testament to a forgotten era of genius. This little florist thinks she can appreciate true artistry? I highly doubt it." She turned back to the crowd, her eyes gleaming with malice. The bet was coming, the final public execution. "I'll make you a deal, little girl," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "A challenge. If you, with your supposed love for all things that grow, can tell us the name of the architect who designed this entire estate. If you can speak his name, I will not only step aside and allow this farcical wedding to proceed, I will personally write you a check for $10 million. A wave of shocked murmurs and cruel, knowing laughter washed over the garden. It was an impossible challenge, a public trap designed for one purpose, to finalize her humiliation. The assumption of her failure was a foregone conclusion. Isabella's friends were already smirking, anticipating the delicious spectacle of Alara's defeat. Julian looked horrified. "Mother, that's insane. How could she possibly know that?" "Precisely," Isabella said, her smile widening. "She can't." Alara stood frozen, the world dissolving into a blur of scornful faces and shimmering heat. The money meant nothing. The wedding meant nothing. All she heard was the casual, brutal dismissal of her life, her work, her family. The insult that she, a lover of flowers, a child of a gardener, could not possibly understand the beauty of a garden was a deeply personal wound. It was an insult to the memory of her grandfather. And in that moment, something inside her, something that had been bent and bowed for years, under the weight of poverty and quiet dignity, finally broke. The fear, the shame, the hurt, it all vanished, replaced by a sudden, shocking clarity. A cold, hard fire ignited in her soul. She lifted her chin. The tears were gone, her eyes clear and steady. She looked past the stunned face of her fiancé, past the sea of mocking guests and met the triumphant, cruel gaze of Isabella Thornton. Her voice, when she spoke, was not the timid whisper Isabella expected. It was quiet, but as firm and unyielding as ancient stone. "I accept your challenge." A hush fell over the Beaumont Gardens. It was a profound and absolute silence, the kind that follows a lightning strike, thick with ozone and anticipation. Every eye was fixed on Elara. The mocking smiles on the faces of Isabella's friends faltered, replaced by a morbid curiosity. They had expected tears, a retreat, a final, pathetic collapse. They had not expected this quiet, steel-spined defiance. Isabella herself seemed momentarily taken aback, a flicker of surprise crossing her features before being replaced by an even deeper, more sadistic amusement. "Excellent," she purred, her voice oozing condescension. "The little weed has thorns after all. Please proceed. The stage is all yours. Dazzle us with your profound knowledge of landscape architecture." Elara took a slow, deliberate breath. She turned away from the altar, away from the frozen, helpless figure of Julian, and began to walk. Her steps were steady, her back ramrod straight. She walked not toward the magnificent fountain, but toward the edge of the stone patio, her eyes scanning the vast panoramic view of the gardens that unfolded below. The world seemed to slow down, each detail becoming sharp and clear. The precise geometric patterns of the hedges, the gentle weeping curve of a willow tree, the exact shade of blue in the delphiniums that bordered the pathways. For a moment, panic, cold and slick, threatened to overwhelm her. What was she doing? She didn't know the name. It was an impossible, ridiculous bet. She had let her pride, her anger, push her into a corner from which there was no escape. She was about to make a fool of herself on a scale she could scarcely imagine. Her hand, trembling slightly, drifted to the small beaded purse at her side. Her fingers brushed against the stiff, aged paper of the envelope her grandmother had given her. "He told me to give it to you if you ever faced true hardship, the kind that tests the very root of who you are." Was this not that moment? With a sense of dreamlike detachment, she opened the purse and drew out the sealed envelope. Her fingers, fumbling at first, broke the brittle wax seal. The whispers in the crowd grew louder, a rustle of silk and speculation. What is she doing? Is that a note? She's trying to cheat. Isabella let out a short, barking laugh. "Looking for a lifeline? I'm afraid Google is not permitted." Elara ignored her. She unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. It was not a long letter. It contained only 2 sentences, written in the same elegant, slightly faded ink as her name on the envelope. Below the words was a small, ornate, old-fashioned brass key, tied to the paper with a faded silk ribbon. The note read, "The greatest treasures are not built of stone, but of kindness. But the stone remembers. Tell them who designed the Gardens of Solace, Gardens of Solace." The name resonated deep within her, a chord struck in a forgotten chamber of her memory. And then, the key. Her eyes darted to the magnificent marble fountain. It was an impulse, a wild, illogical leap of faith. She walked towards it, her gaze locked on the intricate carvings at its base. The crowd parted before her like the Red Sea. She knelt down on the cool stone, her simple dress pooling around her. She ran her fingers over the weathered marble, over the sculpted face of a serene water nymph. And there, tucked away beneath a carved lily pad, almost invisible to the naked eye, was a tiny keyhole, no bigger than her pinky nail. It was tarnished with age, a secret hidden in plain sight for decades. With a hand that was now perfectly steady, she inserted the small brass key. It slid in with a soft, satisfying click. She turned it. There was a quiet, grinding sound, and a small rectangular section of the marble base popped open, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside, protected from the elements, was a small bronze plaque. It was not a maker's mark or a foundry stamp. It was a signature, rendered in a bold, confident script. Elias Vance. The name hit her with the force of a physical blow. Elias Vance, her grandfather, the simple gardener, the man who supposedly left behind nothing but fond memories and worn-out tools. A dizzying, impossible wave of understanding washed over her. The stories her grandmother told, his love for the earth, his sketches of impossible flowers, his quiet, profound wisdom. It all clicked into place. He wasn't just a gardener. He was something more. She stood up slowly, the small bronze plaque clutched in her hand. She turned to face the silent, waiting crowd. She faced Isabella Thornton, whose smug, triumphant smile was beginning to look strained, uncertain. Elara's voice, when she spoke, did not tremble. It rang out across the garden, as clear and pure as the water flowing from the fountain behind her. "This estate has a name," she announced. "It is called the Gardens of Solace." A few people in the crowd murmured in recognition. The name was known, but only to a few. Then she held up the bronze plaque. And it was designed by the man who signed his masterpiece not for public glory, but for the one person he knew would one day need to find it. Her eyes locked with Isabella's. "It was designed by my grandfather, Elias Vance." For a second there was nothing, just the gentle sound of the fountain and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Then a man in the back of the crowd, an elderly gentleman with a shock of white hair and spectacles perched on his nose, shot to his feet. He was a renowned architectural historian, a guest of a guest, there only by chance. "My God," he breathed, his voice trembling with a scholar's excitement. "She's right. Elias Vance, the visionary of the vernacular, the philanthropist architect. Everyone thought all his records, all his work was destroyed in the fire of '88, that his legacy was lost forever." The murmurings in the crowd erupted into a roar of astonishment. People were standing up, craning their necks, their faces a mixture of disbelief and dawning awe. The scorn was gone, replaced by a wave of respect so powerful it was almost a physical force. Some of the women, who had been sneering at her dress only moments before, now had tears welling in their eyes, moved by the sheer romantic poetry of the moment. But Elara only had eyes for one person. Isabella Thornton stood as if she had been turned to stone, the color drained from her face, leaving it a sickly, chalky white. Her mouth was slightly agape, the cruel, witty retort she had been formulating dying on her lips. The sadistic smile was gone, frozen and then shattered, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. It was the face of a queen who had just watched a peasant summon an army from the very earth beneath her feet. "Impossible," Isabella stammered, the word a weak, pathetic puff of air. "That's impossible. He was a bankrupt nobody, a failed gardener." Elara took a step forward, her presence suddenly immense. "He was not a nobody," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "He was my grandfather, and you are standing in his garden." The paralysis that had gripped Isabella Thornton finally broke, shattering into 1,000 pieces of panicked fury. But the immediate, undeniable truth of Elara's claim, had already been confirmed, and it was spreading through the assembled guests like wildfire. The architectural historian, Mr. Abernathy, was now at the front, his eyes wide with the thrill of a lifetime discovery. "This changes everything," he exclaimed, speaking to anyone who would listen. Elias Vance wasn't just a designer, he was a pioneer of ethical architecture. He often retained ownership of his greatest works through complex family trusts to ensure they would never be destroyed or commercialized. If this is a Vance garden, then it's not just a property, it's a protected legacy. The wedding planner, a woman named Clara, who had borne the brunt of Isabella's condescending wrath all morning, saw her chance. She had been publicly berated for the placement of a floral arrangement, an insult that had left her shaken and humiliated. Now, seeing Isabella's mask of control crumble, she felt a surge of righteous courage. With a discreet movement, she pulled out her phone. Her company had managed events at the Beaumont Gardens for years. She had a direct line to the estate's legal administrators. Her call was brief. Her expression, as she listened to the person on the other end, shifted from professional curiosity to wide-eyed shock. She hung up and approached the altar, her face pale. She ignored Isabella and spoke directly to Alara, her voice filled with a newfound profound respect. "Miss Vance," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I've just spoken with the trustees of the Beaumont estate. Mr. Abernathy is correct. The property is held in a perpetual trust established in 1985. The beneficial ownership, it was designated to pass to the sole surviving heir of the creator, Elias Vance, upon their 25th birthday." Clara took a deep breath. "Elara, you turned 25 last month. According to the trust's legal department, you are the owner of this entire estate. This wedding is taking place on your property." The remaining whispers died, smothered by a wave of collective shock. $10 million seemed like a pittance now. Elara wasn't just the granddaughter of the architect. She was the heiress to a landmark, a priceless piece of real estate and artistry. The sheer irony was staggering. Isabella Thornton, in her attempt to humiliate Elara for being poor, had done so on land that Elara herself owned. It was at that moment that Mr. Abernathy, the historian, recalled another piece of the puzzle, a dark and dusty corner of architectural history. His face grew grim. "Wait a minute," he said, his voice dropping. "Elias Vance, he had a partner in his early days, a businessman, not an artist, a man who handled the finances. There was a terrible falling out. Vance accused the man of fraud, of stealing his designs and leveraging his assets to build a separate empire, but all the evidence was lost in that fire." He looked from Elara to Isabella, a dawning horror on his face. Vance's partner, the man who betrayed him and built his fortune on the ruins of Vance's career, his name was Alastair Thornton. A deathly silence. Alastair Thornton was Isabella's late husband, Julian's father, the foundation of the entire Thornton fortune. The bedrock of Isabella's power and arrogance was a lie. It was built on the stolen genius and crushed spirit of Elara's grandfather. The woman who had just called Elara a gold-digging parasite was, in fact, the one whose entire existence was funded by a grand and terrible theft. Isabella staggered back, a hand flying to her chest. "Lies! Slander!" she shrieked, her voice cracking with desperation. She fumbled for her own phone, her fingers shaking uncontrollably. "I'll sue you all. I'll destroy you." She started barking orders into the phone, screaming at her lawyers about statutes of limitation, about legacy claims, about character defamation. Julian, who had been standing like a statue carved from ice, finally moved. He looked at his mother, her face contorted into a mask of ugly, desperate rage. Then he looked at Alara, who stood tall and serene amidst the chaos, a quiet queen who had just reclaimed her stolen kingdom. The world he had known, the mother he had feared and obeyed his entire life, was a monstrous fraud. The woman he loved was the victim of his own family's greatest sin. The shame was a physical weight, crushing him. "Mother," he whispered, but the word was lost in her frantic, panicked tirade. As Isabella continued to scream into her phone, trying to hold back the floodgates with sheer force of will, a new figure emerged from the crowd. He was an older man, his face weathered and kind, his back slightly stooped from a life of physical labor. He wore a simple, clean groundskeeper's uniform. He walked past the gawking millionaires and billionaires as if they were nothing more than ornamental shrubs. He stopped before Ilara and gave a small, respectful bow of his head. His eyes were kind and filled with a deep, ancient sadness. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice soft but clear, "my name is Silas. I was your grandfather's head groundskeeper, his friend." Ilara stared at him, her heart swelling with a new, different emotion. Here was another piece of her past standing right before her. "Your grandfather was the best man I ever knew," Silas continued, his gaze unwavering. "And he was no fool. He knew Alistair Thornton would betray him. He knew his legacy might be buried. But he believed that truth, like a hardy perennial, always finds its way back to the sun." He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small, worn, leather-bound journal. "He told me to keep this safe. He said you would know what to do with it when the time was right." Silas placed the journal in Ilara's hands. It was heavy, filled with page after page of her grandfather's elegant, precise handwriting. "He knew this day might come," Silas said softly. "He left more than just this garden, Miss Vance. That journal, that is the key to everything else." The silent army of the past was beginning to awaken, and the war for the truth had only just begun. The wedding was, of course, over. The guests, after a period of stunned, gossiping paralysis, began to disperse in a hurried, excited flurry. They had come for a society wedding and had instead witnessed the explosive opening act of a dynastic war. The aborted ceremony at the Gardens of Solace became the story of the decade, spreading through the city's elite circles with the speed of a digital virus. Days later, the next battle was formally declared. The setting was not a sun-drenched garden, but the cold, sterile heart of the enemy's empire, the main boardroom on the 50th floor of the Thornton Corporation Tower. The sprawling room was a monument to corporate power, with a table of polished obsidian long enough to land a small aircraft and a panoramic view of the city that made the world below look like a toy set. Isabella Thornton had convened an emergency meeting of the board and its primary shareholders. Her stated purpose was to address the scurrilous and unfounded rumors that threatened to destabilize the company. Her true purpose was to launch a preemptive strike, to consolidate her power, discredit Ilara, and legally sever any claim the Vance legacy might have on her empire before it could take root. Media vans were already swarming the base of the tower like ants on a carcass, their satellite dishes pointed at the sky, hungry for the next chapter of the drama. Isabella sat at the head of the obsidian table, a vengeful goddess on a dark throne. She had regained her composure, encasing her panic in a thick shell of icy rage. Her lawyers, a pack of sleek, merciless sharks in $1,000 suits, flanked her. She was ready for war. Across from her sat Ilara. She was no longer the timid girl in the handmade dress. She was dressed in a simple but elegant dark blue suit, a quiet statement of purpose. Her hair was pulled back, her face clear and composed. At her side was Mr. Silas, his quiet dignity a stark contrast to the aggressive posture of Isabella's legal team. Next to him sat Mr. Abernathy, the historian, clutching a briefcase filled with academic papers and historical records. Isabella began the meeting with a chilling lack of preamble. "Let's dispense with the pleasantries," she said, her voice flat and hard. "We are here to put an end to a frivolous and insulting fantasy. A girl with a lucky story has made some wild accusations, and we are here to swat them down with the hard fist of fact." Her lead lawyer, a man with a cruel, thin-lipped smile, stood up. This was Isabella's final gambit, her unbeatable move. "We have conducted an exhaustive review of the Thornton Corporation's founding documents and all of Mr. Alastair Thornton's personal records," he announced, his voice booming with manufactured confidence. "While it is true that a certain Elias Vance was a minor business associate of the great Alastair Thornton in the early days, his role has been creatively exaggerated." He gestured to an aide who placed a thick, leather-bound document on the table. He opened it with a theatrical flourish. "We have here the original articles of dissolution of their brief partnership, dated 1983. In it, Mr. Vance, facing bankruptcy due to his own fiscal mismanagement, willingly and legally sold all his shares, land rights, intellectual property, and future claims to Mr. Thornton for a one-time payment of $50,000. He projected a copy of the final page onto the large screen at the end of the room. There it was, a complex legal paragraph relinquishing all rights, and below it what appeared to be the flourishing signature of Elias Vance, next to the sharp, angular signature of Alastair Thornton. Isabella smirked, a real triumphant smile this time. It was the ace up her sleeve. The document was ironclad. Forgery-proof, her lawyers had assured her. She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto Ilara's. "There you have it," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "Your grandfather wasn't a betrayed genius. He was a fool who sold his birthright for pocket change. He took the money and ran, and my husband, a true visionary, built an empire from the scraps he left behind. The story ends there." A heavy silence filled the room. The board members, men and women who owed their fortunes to the Thornton dynasty, nodded gravely. The evidence seemed irrefutable. It was over. Then Ilara stood up. She did not look angry. She did not look defeated. She looked calm, her gaze clear and penetrating. "My grandfather was not a fool," she said, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "And he was not a man who ran. He was a man of integrity, a man who believed in truth." She placed the worn leather journal Mr. Silas had given her on the table. It looked small and insignificant next to the imposing legal document produced by Isabella's team. "My grandfather knew he was being cheated," Ilara continued. "He knew his partner was a thief. He knew he couldn't win in a court of law against a man who would forge documents and bribe witnesses, so he did the only thing he could. He kept a record, a perfect, meticulous record of the truth." She opened the journal. This isn't just a diary. It's a ledger. It contains my grandfather's original architectural drafts, which Alistair Thornton later filed patents for under his own name. It contains carbon copies of letters where Alistair admits to leveraging company assets for personal gain. It contains a detailed accounting of the money Alistair was siphoning from their shared accounts. Isabella let out a contemptuous laugh. A dead man's diary? That's your evidence? That's pathetic. It's a start, Alara said calmly. But I didn't come alone. She gestured to the door. It opened, and a procession of people began to file into the boardroom. They were not corporate titans or sleek lawyers. They were ordinary people, their faces etched with the lines of hard-lived lives. An elderly woman leaning on a cane, a middle-aged man in a worn but clean suit, a young woman with fierce, intelligent eyes. Isabella stared, confused. What is this? Who are these people? This, Alara announced, is my grandfather's true legacy. The elderly woman spoke first, her voice frail but steady. My name is Martha Gable. In 1982, the Thornton Bank tried to foreclose on my family's farm. Your husband, Mr. Thornton, held the loan. Elias Vance found out. He used his own money to pay off our debt anonymously. He saved our home. She produced a folder of old bank statements and a letter of gratitude her father had written to a mysterious benefactor, a letter Elias Vance had, in fact, kept. Next came the man in the suit. I am David Chin. I was a junior accountant at Thornton Corp in the 80s. I discovered discrepancies in Mr. Alistair Thornton's expense reports, massive ones. I reported them, and I was fired the next day for incompetence. I've kept my personal copies of those reports for 40 years. He placed a stack of papers on the table. One by one, they came forward. The silent army of the grateful, a dozen people whose lives Elias Vance had touched, whose families he had saved, whose integrity he had honored. Each one held a piece of the puzzle, a canceled check, a notarized letter, a personal testimony that, when woven together, created an undeniable tapestry of Alistair Thornton's fraud and Elias Vance's hidden, persistent goodness. The board members were shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The air of certainty around Isabella was evaporating, replaced by a toxic fog of doubt and suspicion. But the final killing blow did not come from the past. It came from Mr. Silas. He stood and placed a simple, modern USB drive on the obsidian table. Your grandfather was a visionary, Miss Alara, he said, not just with gardens, but with everything. He saw the digital future long before anyone else. That legal document, he said, nodding to Isabella's prized evidence, is a very clever forgery, but the signature is based on his public ceremonial signature. His true legal signature was something he changed after he knew he was being betrayed. Silas continued, but more importantly, he didn't trust paper. In 1984, he worked with a pioneering tech firm to create some of the world's first digital share certificates. Encrypted and stored on a secure, independent server, he converted his entire stake in the partnership, the controlling 51%, into this new format. He pushed the USB drive across the table. This contains the access keys. Alara Vance doesn't just have a moral claim to the land her grandfather's company was built on. She is, and has been, since her 25th birthday, the majority shareholder of the Thornton Corporation itself. The room exploded into chaos. Isabella's lawyer snatched the drive, his face ashen, and plugged it into his laptop. On the screen, a secure portal opened. With the codes from Silas, they accessed the digital vault. There they were, immutable, blockchain-verified certificates representing 51% of the company's foundational shares, registered to a trust for the benefit of Elara Vance. The unanimous verdict came without a formal vote. It was a tidal wave of realization that swept through the room. The board members, seeing the irrefutable evidence of decades of fraud and the undeniable reality of the new power structure, turned their backs on Isabella as one. Her proposals were rejected. Her authority was gone. Her empire had crumbled to dust in the space of 10 minutes. Outside the boardroom doors, alerted by a tip from Clara, the wedding planner, two stern-faced detectives and an agent from the Financial Crimes Unit were waiting. Isabella Thornton was frozen, her mind unable to process the totality of her defeat. The foundation of her world, her wealth, her identity, had been a lie, and the truth had just demolished it. "No," she whispered, the word a dry rattle in her throat. "No, it's all mine. He gave it to me. It's mine." Two security guards approached her respectfully but firmly. "Madam Thornton, you have been removed from the board. You'll have to leave." She was escorted from the room she had commanded for decades, a queen deposed. As the doors opened, she was met by a blinding storm of camera flashes and a cacophony of reporters shouting questions. Her face, stripped of its power and arrogance, now showing only raw, ugly despair, was broadcast to the world, a broken, defeated woman, utterly and completely alone. Julian, who had been watching from the back of the room, finally stepped forward. He looked at his mother being swallowed by the media scrum, and for the first time in his life felt not fear, but a profound and sickening pity. He turned to Elara, his face a mask of shame and regret. "Elara, I'm so sorry." Elara looked at him, the man she had once loved so desperately. There was no anger in her eyes, no triumph. There was only a quiet, sad finality. Their love story had been built on a foundation as rotten as his family's fortune, and now it, too, had collapsed. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of dismissal, not of forgiveness, and turned back to her grandfather's army. The war was over. The healing could now begin. In the quiet aftermath of the storm, Elara's first visit was not to a bank or a lawyer's office, but to the sterile, hushed corridor of the hospital. She walked into her grandmother's room and found her sleeping, her breath a soft, shallow rhythm. The mountain of bills that had once seemed so insurmountable was now a molehill she could level with a single phone call. But the real healing was not about money. She sat by the bedside, and when her grandmother awoke, she told her everything. She spoke of the garden, the key, the journal, and the army of grateful souls her grandfather had secretly cultivated. She spoke of Isabella's downfall and the reclamation of their family's name. Her grandmother listened, her tired eyes slowly filling with tears, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of profound, vindicating pride. "Your grandfather," she whispered, her voice stronger than it had been in months. "He always knew. He always said that goodness, planted in the right soil, would one day grow tall enough to block out the cruelest sun. He knew you would be the one to see the harvest." Later that day, alone in the quiet solitude of the now empty Gardens of Solace, her gardens, Elara finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of the past weeks. The humiliation, the fear, the shock, the triumph. It all came pouring out in a flood of cathartic tears. She cried for the years of struggle, for the quiet dignity of her parents, who had worked themselves to an early grave for the grandfather she had never truly known but now understood so deeply. She wept until she was empty, until all the pain was washed away, leaving behind only a serene, quiet peace. The ghosts of her past had been laid to rest. Her first official act as the head of the newly restructured Vance Foundation, the entity that had absorbed the entirety of the Thornton Corporation, was not one of revenge or corporate conquest. It was an act of pure, unadulterated benevolence. Her first phone call authorized the full and complete funding of the struggling public hospital, where her grandmother was a patient. New wings would be built, the best doctors would be hired, and no family would ever again have to face a mountain of bills for the simple act of trying to save a loved one. Her second act was to call a company-wide meeting for the thousands of employees who had worked under the Thornton regime. They gathered, full of fear and uncertainty, expecting mass layoffs and brutal restructuring. Instead, Elara stood before them and announced that not a single job would be lost. Furthermore, she was immediately instituting a 15% wage increase for all non-executive employees and establishing a generous pension fund funded by the profits that had once been funneled into Isabella's lavish lifestyle. She went through the company's portfolio of predatory loans and, with a stroke of her pen, forgave them all, saving hundreds of families and small businesses from foreclosure. She was dismantling an empire of greed and rebuilding it as an engine for compassion. She was proving with every decision that she had not been corrupted by the power she now wielded. A week later, Mr. Silas came to her office in the Vance Center. He carried one final item, one last ghost from the past. It was another letter, this one separate from the journal, sealed and kept apart. "He told me to give you this only when it was all over," Silas explained, "when the truth was firmly back in the sunlight." Elara opened the letter. It was not a business document or a list of assets. It was a moral treatise, a final loving message from a grandfather to the granddaughter he knew he would never see grow up. "My dearest Elara," it began, the script as elegant and strong as she now imagined him to be. "If you are reading this, it means the world has tested you and you have proven stronger than the world. It means you have reclaimed what was stolen, not for the sake of wealth, but for the sake of truth. I am prouder of you than words can ever say." He went on to explain his philosophy, the core belief that had guided his life. Wealth, my child, is a river. It can be a destructive force, carving canyons of sorrow and flooding the homes of the innocent, or it can be a source of life, irrigating dry fields and bringing forth bountiful harvests of hope. The great sin of men like Alastair Thornton is that they try to dam the river, to create a stagnant private pool for their own vanity. Never let the river become a stagnant pool, Elara. Let it flow. Let it nourish every life it touches. The measure of your legacy will not be how much you kept, but how much you gave away. Elara folded the letter, her heart full. She looked out the window of her office, down at the sprawling city below. It was no longer a landscape of intimidating power. It was a garden, her garden, waiting to be tended. 10 years passed. The name Thornton, once a synonym for ruthless power, was now just a footnote in history books, a cautionary tale whispered in business schools. The Vance Center for Community Arts, housed in the gleaming tower that had once been the seat of Isabella's empire, was a beacon of hope and creativity in the heart of the city. Elara Vance was no longer the girl in the handmade dress, but she had never forgotten her. She was now a respected philanthropist, a titan of ethical industry, but she moved through the world with the same quiet humility that had always defined her. She preferred the company of artists and students to that of billionaires and politicians. Her wealth was a tool, not an identity. One crisp autumn afternoon, she was walking through the gardens of Solace. Her grandfather's masterpiece was no longer a private enclave for the ultra-rich. It was a public park, meticulously maintained and open to all. The laughter of children from all walks of life now echoed where the cruel whispers of the elite once festered. It was a living monument to his philosophy. As she rounded a path near the great fountain, she saw a familiar scene. A young girl, perhaps 10 years old, was sitting on a bench with a basket of wilting hand-picked daisies. She was trying to sell them to passers-by, her face a mask of anxious determination, trying to help her mother, who sat beside her, looking worried and tired. It was a mirror, a perfect reflection of her own past, a life of struggle and desperate hope. Elara's heart ached with a familiar pang. She approached the bench with a warm smile. "Those are beautiful flowers," she said to the little girl. "How much for the whole basket?" The girl, stunned, stammered a price that was far too low. Elara reached into her purse and pulled out a sum of money that made the girl's and her mother's eyes go wide. "I think they're worth much more than that," Elara said gently, pressing the bills into the mother's hand. The mother began to protest, overwhelmed. We can't accept this. It's too much." Elara knelt down so she was eye level with the little girl. "Someone once believed in me when I had nothing but a few flowers and a worried heart," she explained softly. "They taught me that wealth is a river and it's meant to flow. I'm not just giving you money, I'm just letting the river flow." She then offered the girl a full scholarship to the Vance Center's Youth Design Program. Seeing the same spark of creativity in her eyes that Elias Vance must have seen in the world around him. As for the architects of her past pain, their fates were sealed by their own character. Isabella Thornton lost everything. After years of fruitless legal battles, her assets were liquidated to pay for the fraud her husband had committed. She was left with a small, heavily taxed annuity, enough to live on but not enough to command respect or power. She faded into obscurity, a bitter, lonely woman in a small, drab apartment, a ghost haunted by the memory of an empire she had stolen and then lost. She had been offered a second chance, a quiet retirement funded by a forgiving Vance Foundation, but her pride was too great to accept charity from the girl she had tried to destroy. Julian had tried to reconcile. He wrote letters, filled with shame and apologies. But Elara knew he was a man forever defined by his weakness, a permanent satellite to his mother's toxic star. He could never truly escape that shadow. He eventually moved to a different country, living a quiet life, forever marked by the moment he stood by and did nothing. Elara stood by the fountain, watching the young girl and her mother walk away, their steps lighter, their future brighter. She looked over the gardens her grandfather had built, now filled with the laughter of a new generation he would never meet, a generation that would grow up knowing beauty was for everyone. He had planted seeds of kindness and integrity in the dark soil of deceit decades ago. The harvest would be eternal.